Hello everyone. Today we are going to discuss this interesting topic related to problems and issues of education in the developing countries contexts or in the education systems that are developing. And so there are certain issues and common and problems that are quite common in the context of education systems in developing countries. This particular presentation is actually aimed at the students of comparative education at the undergraduate level and at the postgraduate level, especially students in the field of education and more specifically teacher education. So let's see what are some of those common problems and issues that education systems face in the developing countries contexts. So here is a diagrammatic presentation of a kind of chart or a structure of the main issues that are faced by the education systems in the developing contexts. And so when we can begin with asking a question related to the quality of education, and we can think of actually conceptualizing it in terms of the what, how, why, and so what questions related to the quality of education. The what actually, so what is being taught in a particular education system is something that relates to the curriculum. Generally speaking, education systems that are developing or education systems that are there in the more developing countries, and the countries that are not that are still developing or they are passing through the process of development. The education systems are actually representative or a reflection of the overall social and political environment. And so the education system, and especially the curriculum, has certain issues and certain problems. And so the curriculum generally is not very well developed and is actually passing through the process of development and continuous improvement. And in many cases, it takes time, and it's a kind of developing towards a better future. And so the curriculum is, although the curriculum could be in the process of change and development in the more developed countries as well. But in comparison to the curricula or the syllabi or the teaching material that is available in the more developed contexts, the curricula, the syllabi, and the teaching material available in the context of developing countries is still something that has to get to the level of that available in the more developed contexts and the more developed countries. So that is the first issue, that the curriculum is not very well developed and it is still developing and improving. The second thing is the how of the education quality, and the how here actually means how is the curriculum implemented, or how are the courses taught in the practical field. That means in schools, in colleges, and in universities. So generally, teaching methodologies again is a reflection of the general process of development or underdevelopment, and so the teaching methodologies generally are not very well developed. Still, traditional teaching methodologies are followed, and the teacher-centered methodologies are actually in vogue. And so the teaching learning process itself is not very democratic, and it's a kind of one way generally, although there are many countries in the developing context or developing countries where there is a lot of variation as well. Certain education systems inside certain countries are now catching up with the modern development of teaching methodology and pedagogy. That is something, a hallmark of the more developed countries' educational systems. So in many developing countries' contexts, teaching methodologies and pedagogy and the role and the place and role of the teacher and the student are now kind of looking at the systems and the teaching methodologies in the more developed countries, and they are catching up. But again, this is one of the characteristics generally associated with with developing systems, and so it is or it could also be presented as an issue or as a problem that the teaching methodologies are still traditional and still mainly teacher driven and still not very technology driven, and so the use of scientific methods and technology is still something that has to and that has actually to take place. Then the next a part of the education system which is actually facing problems in the developing countries context generally is the evaluation systems. So how are educational processes and outcomes evaluated? How are teaching methodologies and learning processes and the change, the outcomes, which actually means students' achievement or the change in students' behavior, how are those evaluated? Again, in the developing context or education systems which still need to develop and which are in the process of developing, there the evaluation processes are not very well developed. And they are not very much based on the modern scientific methods of evaluation. And so again, this is one of the issues that education systems in the developing countries context face. The evaluation system is not very responsive to, not very sophisticated, and there are also issues related to the use of unfair means in the evaluation and examination systems. And so this again is one of the issues that is kind of reflected in the education systems that are not still very developed. Again, a very important issue that most education systems in developing countries face is actually the lack of resources, or the availability of resources which is not adequate. And so the resources are not adequate. As a result, infrastructures are not very well developed, and modern scientific gadgets and equipments are not available, and the buildings and infrastructure is not very sophisticated. And so because of the lack of resources, the education system is actually impacted. And so this is also one of the issues that education systems in the developing countries contexts face. Then the monitoring, or how is the process of education being monitored? So generally, more developed education systems will have better monitoring systems, which will be actually on the part of the governments and on the part of the larger societies. There are monitoring systems that are available to ensure the quality of education in more developed systems. But in less developed systems or systems of education in the less developed countries, the monitoring systems are not very strong, and again, that is something that impacts the quality of education and all. And then the next one is the ends and goals of education in developing contexts or in education systems which are not very developed. The ends and goals are generally not very clear, and maybe there is a lot of variation inside a particular system in terms of the ends and goals, and because of the unclarity of the ends and goals of education, this is also something that impacts the quality of education. Then very relevant to this one, and it is an associated problem, is the relevance of the educational process. So the question is the overall educational process in line with the needs of the society? In most developed societies and in most developed education systems, the educational process and product are actually in line with the needs of the society. While in the developing countries context, or where the education system is not very well developed, one of the problems that is there is that the educational process and product is generally not very much in line with the needs of the society. And the last one is in this list that I have kind of presented here is the dynamism. The lack of dynamism is something that mars the quality of education in the developing countries context. And this dynamism, the question is the education system responding to change? So generally, more developed education systems or education systems in more developed countries will be a system which will respond to change, to the requirements, to the changing requirements of the society. And so such education systems will be more dynamic and responding to change. On the contrary, education systems generally in the developing countries lack this dynamism, and so there is some kind of status quo, and so this is also one of the issues where which actually stands in the way of modernization and relevance and change in the society. So this is a kind of brief presentation regarding the various issues that are faced by the education systems in the less developed education contexts, or in mainly in the developing countries. Of course, there are other factors, other social, political, economic factors that impact the quality of education that one might think about. And so this is not the final list of those factors, but these are some of the factors that are important, and they impact the quality of education in the developing countries.